And good morning to you. So, continuing on my series of the fun that I have with Git, after doing the last video about me learning Git basics, I just happened to run into two problems on some old projects. And they were both Git problems, fun times, Git and IDE problems. So I thought I would just mention some of the potential complications that can occur when you rely upon your IDE to manage or perform Git operations on your behalf. And just for context, I work with a couple different platforms. I'm bridging a couple different worlds. So I still work with Dynamics GP customers, and I use Visual Studio of many versions, with Dynamics GP many versions, and SQL Server many versions. And so I have to maintain all of that environment, and that includes ASP.NET, that includes .NET Framework, it includes .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, IIS, you name it, all the plumbing in between. Well, I'm also obviously learning Business Central and VS Code and get in that environment with Docker and all of that stuff for Business Central. So those are two very different worlds. So I think when I tweet or talk about something, some people assume that it is only Business Central and only Visual Studio Code, and often that is true. But I just wanted to share that it can really depend on what you're working on, and I suspect you can get yourself in some of the same problems even in the Business Central environment. So I'm proceeding very cautiously based on my experience with Visual Studio and Git over the last 8 years or so, however long I've been using it. And I'm still a complete novice and dangerous when it comes to Git. And this is part of the reason why. It's my reliance upon the IDE, I believe. It's gotten me in a lot of trouble. So I'll show you a few examples of that now. So at least two fundamental problems that I've observed based on my own experience of starting with Visual Studio to work with Git. Relying upon the IDE user interface to perform Git operations, whether that's in Visual Studio or VS Code, and those are completely different worlds. So just be aware that when someone says Visual Studio, they're not necessarily referring to VS Code, and those two IDEs work with Git in completely different ways, and the UI is different, and your user experience is very, very different between those two applications in my experience. So I'm not equating them, I'm just warning you. So I have relied upon the IDE exclusively to perform Git operations in Visual Studio, and I'm starting out with that in VS Code, but I want to move on from that. I do not want to be solely relying upon the IDE. And some of the problems that occur are bugs. There are definitely bugs in Visual Studio. I've seen some weird behavior in VS Code, but I haven't been able to reproduce it in a way that I can nail it down as being a quirk or an issue in VS Code. In Visual Studio, historically, there has been very limited support for Git operations. It kind of worked, but as soon as you needed to do something unusual or something different, you're like, oh, wait a minute. You can do that in Git, because it's just not exposed in the full Visual Studio IDE when you're working with the team, whatever the team plugin or pane is in full Visual Studio. As a result of this and not really understanding the underlying mechanics, that has resulted in me using Visual Studio with Git in a certain way, and that is very likely not the proper or best or advisable or most advantageous way to use Git. So I've found myself in situations where I couldn't fix the problem with Visual Studio and Git. I couldn't fix my code. I couldn't branch the way I wanted to. I couldn't merge, whatever the case was. I couldn't roll back. I couldn't do a retroactive patch to a branch. And it's just, I was relying upon the limited user interface available in the IDE, and I just didn't know what I was doing. So I'm looking to eventually rectify that. Okay, so with that, but it's so pretty. I mean, look at that splash screen. Like, I just want to, if that isn't cool, like, come on. You gotta want to use something with a splash screen like that because it's fancy and it's got purple polka dots and it's wavy and pretty. And in 2019, I mean, that's pretty current, right? Wait, what year is it? So then you have this nice, when you launch Visual Studio, it says, hey, do you want to clone a project? Let me take care of that for you. Clone or check out code, just paste in a URL. It's cool. I'll take care of it for you. It's so enticing, especially if you're new to the Visual Studio or VS Code environments, especially if you're new to Git. It's like, oh, I don't have to learn these cryptic command lines and understand this complex thing called Git. Visual Studio is just handling it. It's going to check it out copacetic. So you paste in this URL, you click a button, and voila, you have your code on a local repo, and you just start coding. Easy peasy, right? Well, eventually you'll run into weird things like this. This is me this week. I was working with an old project. It's well over, I think over 6 years old. And I'm handing this off to another developer. And I noticed something strange. We're like, wait a minute. Why is this file, why are these files missing from Visual Studio? Like Visual Studio works differently than VS Code. And it will list files even if they got deleted. And we see a list of files that were there, they're listed, but they have this mark indicating, wait, Visual Studio saying, I can't find the file. So it maintains the metadata of the file, but when the files disappear, it lets you know. And so I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, that's weird. And I go into source control, like what happened to these files? And I'm looking through my source control, which is on the left there. And I'm like, well, okay. I open up these branches and I see different files. Some files are in this branch, other files are in that branch. Some branches have no files, other branches have a few files. It's weird. I'm like, what is going on here? I go to look in Visual Studio right here. I only see two branches. I see master and v3.0. And I'm thinking, what? Where are my other branches? And then I kind of remember that I had to build a new server, new dev server for this project, this client, so I could have a dedicated server just for this project. It was that big, that complex. It took hours to produce a dev environment with all sorts of moving pieces, all sorts of integrated applications, and dev environment, IIS, ASP.NET, like 10 pieces to get it all together, lots of SQL Server setup. So dedicated environment. And as part of that, I'm guessing I cloned the code. And when I did that, Visual Studio pulled down just the master branch. And I'm thinking, okay, how do I get my other branches? And I see v3.0, that's apparently the latest branch I was working on. But I was like puzzled. Why can't I see all these branches? So I posted this on Twitter, and I'm looking on Stack Overflow, like how do you clone all your remote branches local? And there are 43 answers on Stack Overflow on just one of the versions that was posted to Stack Overflow, one of the questions. And I'm looking at this like, you have got to be kidding me. I want to clone all branches locally, and there are 43 different answers, and people much smarter than me arguing about which series of Git commands is the right way to simply clone your remote branches locally. And I'm thinking, no, like I'm not going to run any of these commands on my dedicated dev box because I don't want to screw up the code I have. I have enough problems with Git. And I don't know what I'm doing at the command line because, like I said, I've been relying upon the IDE. Well, Natalie on Twitter gave me a clue that made me think. And she works primarily with VS Code, and she says, well, in VS Code, when you clone, all your branches are there. And I'm like, huh, okay, maybe it's Visual Studio, something quirky on Visual Studio. And so I did a test with a newer version of Visual Studio. And look at that. So on the left is Visual Studio 2013, which is the Visual Studio that is being used for this customer in this environment in that dev situation. This on the right is Visual Studio 2017, and I believe 2019 will behave exactly the same. So you'll notice two versions of Visual Studio, when you rely upon the IDE to perform Git operations for you, something as simple as even a clone, they behave completely differently. And so 2013 was kind of crude and limited and had some quirks. And when you cloned, you only got one branch. And I'm guessing I figured out a way to pull down a different branch, but I don't remember what it is. I looked all the menus and the drop downs at the top there in Team Explorer. I couldn't find a way to explore my other branches. There's probably a way. And yes, there's probably a way to use command line. But again, I'm not about to start suddenly issuing Git command lines on my critical dev environment and screw things up. And so the newer version of Visual Studio does behave differently. I do see the remote branches, and I can presumably click on those or pull them down and get them locally if I wanted to. I'm not going to do that because, like I said, this client's dev environment is VS 2013. I'm not going to touch that. And you might ask, well, that's dumb. If you know Visual Studio 2017, Visual Studio 2019 fixes this Git issue, why don't you upgrade? You're using an old IDE. Duh. Well, yes, and there is a very good reason why I'm using that old IDE. This is what happens when you just decide to upgrade your Visual Studio with an old project. And this will suck an hour of your day as you try to figure out what in the world Visual Studio just did to your solution. So this is a project I was actively working on. I didn't just upgrade it. It was in Visual Studio 2019, I believe, and it had been upgraded over 10 years. Worked fine. I was debugging, I was compiling, producing new builds. Well, the next day I open up this project and it compiles once, and then I go to compile it again, and this is what I see. I didn't change anything. I don't know what happened, but Visual Studio decided that I suddenly needed a second Settings Designer CS file. It said, oh, let me create one called settings1designer.cs. Now, after an hour of just what is going on here, I finally remembered I'd seen this before. This has happened to me multiple times when I've upgraded projects between versions, from older to newer versions of Visual Studio. There are bugs in Visual Studio, every single version, and they can be brutal. They will absolutely stop you cold, and you will not be able to get any work done, and they will trash your solution. And sometimes you can reconstruct it, sometimes you can't, and I need to roll back to an old version or restore whatever. Hopefully I have a copy. This is one of those bugs. And what will happen is it will create two versions of your settings file. And unless you know what you're looking for, it is absolutely perplexing trying to solve this problem. Fortunately, I happened to see this file after digging into trying to figure out what's going on. I was able to remove that file, remove it from all the metadata, and magically everything started working again. But I was absolutely down, unable to do any work because of Visual Studio 2019. So, newer version does not necessarily mean less bugs. You just have different bugs, and unless you know what those bugs are, you're just trading one for another, and it's a pretty scary situation when you're in the middle of dev trying to get something done and everything breaks. So upgrading your IDE is not a panacea. Now, I have not seen the same level of quirks yet in VS Code, but I've only been using VS Code for less than a year, I think. So early days. I've been using Visual Studio forever, well over a decade. So And that brings me to my next point. If anyone tells you, why don't you just upgrade Visual Studio or VS Code or whatever, this is why. Dev is prod for devs. If you do not treat your dev environment as prod, you're asking for it. My dev is my prod. Sure, the customer has their prod environment and that runs prod transactions and processes prod data, but my dev environment, whether that's my workstation, my laptop, my server, my VMs, whatever, my dev is my prod. If my dev is down, my prod is down. I cannot do work. If there is a bug that I'm trying to fix, if my dev is down, I cannot help my customers. So I have multiple environments, multiple systems, multiple Docker containers. I use Veeam on my Hyper-V VMs. I pay hundreds or thousands of dollars over the last few years to get commercial grade VM backups using Veeam, that I have multiple on-site backups. I have multiple off-site backups. It is my prod environment. So I do not treat my dev as something that I can just upgrade on a whim. I'm very careful because I've been burned multiple times and it's not fun. So my dev IDE is my prod environment. My dev server is my prod server. My dev Docker containers, they might as well be prod. And I have to have production processes around my Docker environment and my Docker containers. And if you happen to know Waldo and follow him on Twitter, ask him what he thinks about Windows updates and Docker updates and upgrades in his dev environment. It is highly disruptive. As soon as you're down for an entire day because some Docker upgrade broke your entire build pipeline, you treat dev differently. Dev is prod. Just my opinion, but this is my livelihood, so I do not mess with my dev environments. So, with that soapbox, moving on. Okay, Git ignore, otherwise known as Git ignored. Look at this. Isn't this pretty? This, again, this is Visual Studio, and it's not VS Code, two very different worlds. So Git ignore in Visual Studio, it's been so long that I've honestly forgotten how that file is generated, but I think it's totally automatic because I have not had to create, I can't remember ever having to create a git ignore file in years in Visual Studio. And so when you create the project and check it in and add it to source control, then you get this monster of a git ignore file. And one of the reasons, one of many reasons, is that Visual Studio creates all sorts of bizarre local temporary metadata files and databases and just a bunch of noise that you do not want to push up into Git. So they have to have this fun git ignore file to try to prevent that. And it depends on what language you're using, because Visual Studio, you can code in multiple languages, have different types of projects. So they're covering the gamut here. And what is a chutzpah test file? Like, seriously? I don't even know what that means. teamcity.cover, NuGet packages, new init, MS test results. Like, I don't know what any of this stuff is. And fake assemblies, like what fake, let's see, can you see that? I don't even know where it is. Yeah, light switch. I mean, it's like a museum of Microsoft tools and technologies in this thing. So can you spot the git ignore line that, as I was referring to earlier, when I went into my project, a whole bunch of files were gone from Visual Studio. And it's saying, you used to have 10 files here. Right now you have 1. And I finally figured out why. It's because I was using the default git ignore file in Visual Studio. And guess what? It excluded the entire directory that I was using for those files. And can you spot where it is? Can't see it? Let me help you out here. Can you see it now? It's the default git ignore. Like, how could that possibly cause problems, right? You can't see it? Let me help you out here. And I'll give you a clue. The files were SQL scripts. And guess what I named my subdirectory in my project folder to store my SQL scripts? Yep, SQL. So by creating an SQL folder, which I think is fairly logical, to store my SQL script files for a bunch of stored procedures required for this project, I was excluding those files, rather ironically, from my source code control. And I apparently was excluding those for over 6 years and did not realize it. Now, strangely, somehow, some of the files got checked into Git. And so I might have been using an older git ignore on an older version of Visual Studio. I'm not sure. But I see the folder in my Git repo. I see some SQL files in that folder. But everything that's shown in Visual Studio now, except for one file, is not in source control. So, yes, good times, right? And 6 years later, when I'm handing this source code over to another developer and he says, why are all these files missing? And I'm thinking, that's a good question. I do not know why all of my SQL scripts are missing from source control, are missing from the zip file I sent you. They're just gone. So fortunately, I maintain a copy of those files on my file system on my desktop, which is backed up 3 ways to Sunday. And I was able to zip up those files and send it to him. And we also have a prod and test environment where we can rescript them. But once again, dev is my prod. And by relying upon the GUI in Visual Studio and the default git ignore, I've been going essentially over 6 years without having my SQL scripts in source control. And I had no idea. That was a valuable lesson. Now, my understanding in Visual Studio Code, based on my experience so far working with BC and AL, is that git ignores are not created by default. Or if you do create a default git ignore, it is so basic that it is unlikely at this point to get you into trouble. It's very limited. And then you go in and manually add the entries you want in the git ignore. Or better yet, you just keep your favorite git ignore on file. You just copy it into VS Code and magically it follows those rules and does what you want. That's what I'm doing now, based on advice from Waldo, I believe, when I took his DevOps course. So that was a very valuable lesson. So with that preaching, let me just give something a try here. So Studio 4. Okay. This is the test DevOps, Azure DevOps repo that I created in the last video. And so I have a repo called test1. Yeah, can't really see the repos, but yep, there's my repo test1. And it has files in it. And I can go down here to branches. And I can see that I have a main. That's the default main branch. I have a dev branch I created. Then I have the feature 1, 2, and 3 that I created, simulating multiple feature development for multiple developers. And I merge those features into dev, and then I merge the dev into main. And so everything looks good. So let me simulate what I was trying to do in Visual Studio, and which Natalie pointed out, like, this works fine in VS Code, so I don't know what your problem is. And so I was like, oh, okay, so that was good to know. I thought it was like a fundamental thing where when you clone a repo, you do not get branches. But so what we're going to do is we're going to go in here. I'm going to choose my main branch, for instance. And previously, I used, when I clicked on clone, when I first created this project, I used the clone in VS Code button. And that alone is a form of relying upon the GUI, right? It's DevOps, it's not the IDE, but it's a reliance upon a GUI to perform a Git operation. Now it works fine in this case, but let's try this. I'm going to go into VS Code and I'm going to, oops, let me do that again. I need that welcome page because I'm still relying upon the IDE, which is part of the problem. So I'm going to click on clone repository here. And it says, please provide the URL. I'm going to paste that in. That's my test1 Git repo, right? I'm going to hit enter. Oops. Hit enter. Okay, now where do I want to save this? Now I'm going to go to Documents AL, but rather than overwrite my existing test1, I'm going to create a new folder called clone test. How's that? So it's going to go into clone test, select repo location, cloning Git repo, and this is the, there we go. This is a mistake I made last time. While talking, this went away. And so another UI reliance opened the repo, right? So I'm noticing all these times I'm relying upon the IDE and the UI to handle Git operations and conveniences that make me not realize what's going on. Okay, so I'm now in my README, which has all of our final code, feature 1, 2, and 3. And now this is the difference. If you look in the bottom left corner here, I have main because I cloned my main branch, presumably. That's another question, actually. Let's go back here. And let me copy that. Okay, so this URL does not have a branch listed. So that's an interesting question. So if I say this is cloning the repo, if I go to branches and I have feature 3 branch, can I clone the branch? I don't think so. Sorry, I just want to figure this out because let's say I know I want to work on the dev branch or the feature 3 branch. Yeah, so that's kind of, as far as I could tell, you're cloning the repo and you're not cloning a particular branch. So even though you're navigating to a branch in DevOps, when you do clone, it's just a clone. It's a repo clone. And the branch is not involved at that point. So moving back here, I have cloned this repo and you see it says main branch down here. Now if I click on main, I can then see, I have main, origin main, dev head, feature 3, feature 2, 1. So it is reading my origin branches, my remote branches in Azure DevOps. And although these are not local, right? So right now I only have local main. I can have origin main, dev head. So what if I want to work on feature 3? If it says select a ref to check out. And so I'm going to click on feature 3. Now what I just did was I told Visual Studio Code to perform a Git operation on my behalf. I don't even know what that is, like, what is that called? So if it says select a ref to check out, is that Git checkout? Is that Git some variant of Git clone? Is it get the Git branch? I don't even know. So that's one of the problems I have with this reliance upon the UI. Now, once I know what it's doing and I know how to do that at the command line, I may be perfectly comfortable using this and it may be perfectly acceptable to use this. But at the moment, I do not know what's going on behind the scenes. When I choose feature 2, what did it just do? I don't know. It did something. It switched branches. There's feature 2. If I go to dev, okay, it works, but I don't know what it's doing, and I don't like that lack of understanding because, like I said, the last 10 years I've been doing that, and I've had no idea what I'm doing. And when there's a problem with this, when this doesn't work, or when you're in a complex scenario where you need to fix something, and this doesn't have the magical, simple, user-friendly menu option that you need, you feel very stuck, and I don't like that feeling. So with that, this appears to work, so thank you, Natalie, for pointing that out. I can see my origin remote branches here and switch. It's not all local, which is one one thing that I would like. Okay, so Eric says Control J, check the console. So I have seen this show some things with Git operations, but it doesn't always show other things. So I have terminal here, and I don't know if this is the correct view. Output maybe. Let's see what happens. So when I do dev and I do feature, let's do feature 1. Yeah. So it doesn't show what it's doing. Now, I have done something else. Like I think it was when I created a new branch or something, I did see some Git commands appear in here, but for the behind the scenes. So so Jeremy and Eric are providing suggestions on how to potentially see this, but like I don't know what I'm doing. So I need to figure that out. I need to find out, okay, what exactly is VS Code doing when I'm switching branches or when I'm doing a stage or a commit or a stash or whatever, a merge. I want to know all the corresponding Git commands and have comfort that I know exactly what VS Code is doing, know that I can reproduce all these steps via command line, and I want to be comfortable. I've gone far too long not understanding this. So, so output Git, like I see Eric and Jeremy are saying output Git. No idea what that means. So output Git. Oh, okay. So there you go. And do you have Git Lens installed? And so it's like, okay, then you're of reliance upon extensions. So that's another thing, right? So I would rather be able to perform these things. And if I eventually rely upon Git Lens or Git Graph or whatever, that's fine. I want to be able to handle these on my own and get to a point where, okay, I know exactly what these are doing. So here we go. Is most likely packed. Like, okay, so let's see what happens if I go from feature 1 to feature 2. Git checkout feature 2. Git static symbolic ref. Like, holy... I mean, this may be kind of obvious when you know what it's doing, but okay, let's clear this. Clear output. So let's see if I can go to... I think I've checked everything out, so let's go back to origin main. Yeah, so git checkout queue main. I don't know what the queue means, so basically, thank you for this. So output, and then you have to choose Git from the dropdown. So apparently these extensions different extensions have different output windows, and so this shows you what it is doing behind the scenes. So that's good to know. Okay, so now I just need to understand what all this noise is, not all of it, but hopefully some of it, and get a better understanding of what's going on. So with that, that's just my perspective on relying upon an IDE to perform Git operations, and then when I want to get into more advanced operations, I'm pretty sure that this will have limitations. And so, for instance, I spoke with someone and they said, oh, we do Git rebase, or one of those things like Git rebase, and like, couldn't even tell you. Like, what do I do? Pull rebase? Fetch prune? And, you know, so rely upon these menus. Do I want to stash, apply, pop, or drop? I don't know. I need to understand all of these commands before I'm comfortable even using these menus. So there's a lot there. And the UI is very cool, makes it super convenient, so you're not popping between the IDE and command line and console and issuing commands and having to keep track of things. But it just, if I'm relying upon this, I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have confidence that I can solve problems. And that's why I get into these fun problems. Okay, so with that, have a good Friday. And go break something. Just do it on a test project. Don't do it on your multi-million-dollar live production project. Okay, have a good one.